Swamiji is right in commenting that seek ye first the kingdom of God is perhaps all that we need if we can understand how to do it, because it really summarizes the whole dilemma of the spiritual path, especially as we are being guided to live it now. We don't have the freedom. Some people might feel that this is a positive thing, some might feel as a negative thing, to just turn away from this world and go off into monasteries or to caves or to isolated places where the enormous complexity of this world, we're just spared it. Some of us who have those more deep-seated positive memories of those kind of lives from past incarnations look with favor on that life. Others who have less positive memories of those lives constantly are relieved that we're not caught in those places. I remember when David and I went to visit we were somewhere in Greece. I think it was actually even our honeymoon. And we went to a monastery that was no longer a monastery. And there was this little stone room with a little stone bed, and it was just absolutely primitive. And I just loved it in there. I just didn't want to leave. It seemed so free to be able to reduce everything that you deal with down to almost nothing. When I had the opportunity to visit a sadhu who lives up above Badrinath in India, he lives, must be about 12 or 14,000 feet there, and he lives in a little hut. He probably still does, a little hut that was I think he actually had 2 rooms, but the entire square footage was about half of where I'm standing right now. The little doorway of his hut just looked out, and all you saw was the tall mountains. He had almost nothing, except just exactly what he needed and not a thing more. And once again, there's just this extraordinary sense of freedom to be able to just turn your back. Just think of it. I'm sure all of you have the same life I do. You're cleaning out the refrigerator, you're washing the dishes, you're having to deal with the clothes. This one has to be dry cleaned, this one goes into the washing machine. Oh, these shoes need to be repaired. Something's wrong with the car. The children need this to be taken care of. On and on and on and on it goes. Anguishing monotony is the word Yogananda used in a more cosmic sense, but sometimes when I just realize the dishes are in the sink again, how did they get there? I heard on the radio a woman with 5 children wrote a book about motherhood, and the title of the book was classic. It was, "Didn't I just feed you yesterday?" Which just sort of sums up the whole cycle that we have to go through. And in the end, you have nothing, really, except just the progression of life. Of course, it's not a terrible thing, and we can easily reverse it and find all different ways to say it. But a great deal of life is just monotonous. And even the most challenging and delightful of jobs, the most creative opportunities, just have their the grunge work. I can't think of a better word for it, just where it's just tedious and you just have to keep going through it. Swami Kriyananda used to talk about the difference between having to edit what he'd written and the writing of it. He repeatedly talked about editing, and the word he kept using was, it's hard work. And it's not particularly creative. There's no particular inspirational thrill. It's just word by word. You have to look at it and see if you've actually got the right words. But you have to do it with sufficient energy and consciousness so that you don't kill the spirit of the book. And there's just no way around it. It's just hard work. Everything comes down to that. And people who expect the fruits of their labor without labor don't really succeed. But coming back to our theme here today, there's a certain feeling that grows in the heart when one has a certain karma on the spiritual path, or samskars, which is to say karma, impressions from the past. Samskars are the impressions that are left lingering in your consciousness from previous experiences. It's a more subtle word than just your subconsciousness. It's impressions on your soul that cause you to lean in a certain direction. There is a certain point where it's just like you really don't, your aversion to doing that is what's known as vairagya. Vairagya is simply a lack of an inclination toward worldly life. It's not merely the way I feel when I'm doing the dishes, which is, where are the servants? That's a wholly different feeling, I want you to understand. I recently had the opportunity when we went to India at the beginning of September. We stayed with a friend. Usually we stay in the ashram, but they were shifting the ashram, and so there was no place for us. So we were billeted, my friend Shivani and I, with a woman named Kanta, a lovely lady who has a large flat, 3 bedrooms, and she lives there alone. So Shivani and I each had our own room, and we had the driver and the cook and the housekeeper and the laundress, and it's an easy life to get used to, believe me. You just, nothing of the mundane world is your responsibility. You can argue it either way. But vairagya is something else. Vairagya is the feeling in your heart that you're being called to another reality. That it's not so much that you're averse to this one as that you're being called to another. When Master was explaining to Swamiji how for spiritual liberation you have to have no desire for anything in this world, so Swami raised an obvious logical questions. Well, then people who commit suicide, that would seem to me that they have no desire for anything of this world, including even the continuing of their own body. Master said, oh no, there must also be a positive longing for God. This is not about escape. This is about transcendence, and it's something completely different. Now, contemplating Jesus' words here, seek ye first the kingdom of God, we have to understand this on the level that Jesus himself meant it. And as above, so below, Swamiji mentions also in this, which is that we're molding ourselves to a higher reality. And it is simply true that the way this world is constituted, the body requires just a certain amount of care, at least at this time in this yuga. Swamiji remarked that Hawaii is a place where you almost don't have to incarnate in the physical world, at least Hawaii before the missionaries arrived, when it was just the natives. You needed almost no clothes, you needed almost no shelter, you didn't have to work to have food. It just grew all around you, or you pulled it from the sea. And just tremendous freedom from the imposition of the material world. But here we are in the material world, and it imposes on us in countless ways. So what happens is that people, because the imposition of the material world is so intense, we make the mistake of thinking that that's actually our priority. That the reason we're actually here is to take care of ourselves physically. When I was living as a renunciate, as a nun, in my early spiritual years, my first almost decade, it was in my 20s, I lived in a trailer which was smaller than the cabin of the sadhu in the Himalayas. It was just a little wider than that. It was just a little shorter than a full gesture in the energization exercises. Those of us who would energize inside our trailers always got in the habit of going like this. Even when we're outside, we had to learn to raise your hand because your trailer roof was not so tall. It was maybe twice this. So it was spacious. There were holes in the floor, which I considered ventilation. Sometimes when I would shut the door, I'd sort of capture all this grass, so I had sort of an indoor garden. I had a heater. I could never live without a heater. It was so feeble. It actually belonged to Shivani, but when Shivani moved away, she traded. I had a better one, but she told me she had promised this trailer it would never have to move again. So she was ready to move, so she took mine, which was more mobile, so I downgraded into this. And it was painted inside a lovely shade of orange, kind of Halloween orange, really bright. Probably trying to mimic the Swami color, but I loved that place. And I used to imagine, this is the part that I vividly remembered, I didn't have any idea what God had in store for me. And marriage was only part of it. It was just this. I didn't know this was coming. I was living out in the wilderness, and I just expected to stay there forever. No indoor plumbing. The water spigot was right outside this trailer. It was luxury accommodations. But I kept thinking, I have so little now, and as life progresses, I'll have less and less. And I would sometimes think how that's not really how most people think. Most people think that as life progresses, I'll have more and more. and I'll get more and more comfortable, and I'll have everything just the way I wanted it. And my image was, well, I still need this much, but as I progress on the spiritual path, I'll have less and less. I had different lessons to learn. Actually, having to acquire a home, the home we built at Ananda Village, was a huge spiritual test for me. It was very difficult for me because my mind was skewed a little. It wasn't true vairagya. Part of it was just a little bit of, as long as I'm poor, I must be spiritual. Look how poor I am, therefore I must be really spiritual. A little fear of the material world that I had to overcome. But nonetheless, there is and was a profound truth in that. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And then even wherever God takes you, you will never be outside of that kingdom, you see? And for me, I'm always so grateful for that decade of extreme simplicity. I like to think in my heart that I could go back to that. I feel in my heart I could. I don't know if I could in my body. We'll have to see if it ever comes to that. But wherever we are, whatever we're doing, don't mistake the external for the truth. If God gives you more, which, as I said, Swami pushed us to build that house because he saw, for many reasons, why we had to do it. He also said in America, Swamiji used to drive this car. I mean, we lived the way we lived because it was the top that we could afford. When a group of people get together to try to do something dynamic, sacrifice is necessary. Tapasya, which is austerity for the sake of devotion. A tremendous amount of tapasya is required to accomplish anything. Even just if you're going to be an Olympic athlete, you have to make choices. The energy has to come from somewhere. And the energy comes from the concentrated power that we exert. And the word tapasya, which doesn't have an exact English translation, because it's not sacrifice with any negative connotation. It's the patient application of willpower by withdrawing that, by not dissipating your forces, just focusing it. Ananda, what it's become now 40 years later, was the result of an enormous amount of tapasya. At the time, it didn't feel like anything. I mean, I actually occasionally looked at that little trailer that I loved, and I loved the downgrade from the better one, in fact. And every so often I'd see it objectively. This is a wreck. This is just a piece of junk. This is a tiny little nothing. It has no indoor plumbing, And then I would think, people might think this is difficult. I'm looking at Karen and David, and I remember they talked about how they lived in a teepee, which they still describe as their favorite home of all time. And they talked about when his parents, I think, came to visit, and they sat in the teepee, which Karen and David thought was just the finest home they'd ever seen. And the parents, oddly enough, started reminiscing about the Depression. Only later did all the pieces come together. But we were seeking the kingdom of God. And we were seeking it first, and we were seeking it only. And I honestly feel that later on, as Swamiji has often put it, what comes of itself, let it come. I was starting to say, we lived the way we lived because we didn't have any more money than that. I've joked with you all, I used to have this pottery jar. I got paid $50 a month in cash. I was on Swami's salary. He opened his wallet at the beginning of every month and handed me $50, which was a lot more in 1971 and 2 than it is now. I didn't have to pay any rent. All my fees were waived because I worked directly for him. And I would have that money in cash, and I put it in this opaque jar. It being opaque was important because I just believed that Divine Mother would take care of me, which she invariably did. No matter what happened, I always had enough. I never had anything extra, but I always had enough. Sometimes Gary's brother, Ananda, he had an incredible intuition for knowing things, and just when I was totally out of money, he would slip $100 to me. I never asked him, I never even thought about it, but he just always somehow could sense when I was out of money. Or I would find money, which was unthinkable. I'd find money in my own house. I had so little, how could I have ever lose any of the little money I had? But sometimes I would find it. It was just there. It was all about this jar. Some of you, since I'm in this reminiscent mood, when I married David, who actually had a checkbook and ran businesses and things, I moved in with the jar like this. And very kindly, I remember he sort of took it out of my hands and said, I don't think we'll need this anymore, and put it over here. But it was a big moment for me, because that was how it worked. But everything was always there, in abundance. And I could go back, when I was talking to Swamiji about what causes us to want to reincarnate. And he said, anything that you long for. If you, what was the word? It was longing and regret. Longing and regret. And he said that to me, and I said, well, sir, I could go back to that first decade in a heartbeat. It was heaven on earth. Oh, he said, that's different. That's not an unfulfilled longing. That's just a pleasure and an experience. But it was powerful to have so little, because then you find out what is really important to you. And once you know what's really important, you can go anywhere. You can go anywhere. Swamiji always lived much more expansively than the rest of us lived, and many people in those early years didn't understand that. They didn't understand, but he could, you see, because it literally meant nothing to him. And in the end, he had 3 homes, on 3 different continents, and each one was set up just the way he needed it to be set up. But it was perfectly simple living for him, because he simply had exactly what he needed. And in the midst of it, it was always about the divine work. It was never about what was there externally. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. I remember I was starting, just to finish this story, the car that Swami drove for many years, we'd gotten for $75 through some government auction. And it had belonged to the Air Force, and it had been painted over, and it very faintly said Air Force still on the side. So of course we called it Air Force One. What else could we call it? And there was actually an Air Force Two, which was the mate to this car, which we bought for the parts. So we bought 2 of them, and one of them sat by the mechanic's shed, and every time the first one would break, then the parts would be replaced. It was a big blue Chevrolet. Drove it for many years for $75. Then once we drove to San Francisco for a big conference of spiritual teachers. And that was the big heyday in the 70s of all of the stuff that was happening. And Rajneesh was around, and he had a fleet of Rolls Royces, and there was some people took different attitude than Swamiji. So we came and parked this car, and really it was Mercedes-Benz and Rolls Royces and Cadillacs and new cars. This was all well, I don't mean to be rude, but it was a lot of the spiritual teachers in America at that time, and we pulled up in this piece of junk and just parked it and piled out. But Swamiji, it was very interesting. He looked at all of that, and he said, I have to get a new car. He said, in India, they would respect me for driving this car. In America, they think there must be something wrong with the teaching. Because in America, money is so much easier to come by that if you can't manifest money, they must doubt the efficacy of what you're doing. Isn't that interesting? So he went out and he bought a Ford. Nothing too expensive, but just like that. He said, in America, you have to show that you can also master the material world. And he said something else that was interesting. He said, you have to have a certain level of refinement in the way you present yourself externally, because otherwise people won't appreciate how refined your ideas are. So he sort of trained us to bring everything up to a certain level. And thus, we weren't allowed, that's how I feel, allowed to stay in those humble nothing circumstances that we had at the beginning. That was tapasya, in order to break our own attachment and dependence, and to make a clear line between the inner and the outer kingdom. Now that's a very dramatic way to do it, is by reducing yourself to nothing, discovering what's really important to you, and then you're fine after that. But we now all live in much more comfortable circumstances. I mean, nobody in this room is truly poor. Many of us have less or more, but poverty, most poverty in America, there is real poverty in America, but most poverty in America isn't like poverty that you see in other countries. Poverty in America can be one telephone and a black and white TV, not a piece of the sidewalk although of course that exists also in this country. But the point being, seek ye first the kingdom of God. Where are you living? In your heart. Where are you, no matter where you are? What would happen to you if everything suddenly changed? What would you be then? Who would you be? Well, how do you define yourself? I always had this beautiful picture in my mind, which I just loved, when Ananda was the subject of litigation. This is now quite a few years ago, but we were involved in a civil suit, and it was whenever there's a first church of and a second church of, there's always a point when the first church of tries to wipe out the second church of. Well, we were the second church of self-realization, and the first church of self-realization, having enjoyed a monopoly for a long time, decided they wanted to extend their monopoly by pushing us off the edge. So it's a civil suit, which means that all your property is at stake. So we went through this for quite some time, more than a decade, and there was a real chance that it would all go back to dust, which was not a small thing, because a lot of tapasya had gone into getting it out of the dust, but there was a real chance that it would go back into dust. So I always had this picture, every time I would feel even slightly anxious about it, I would have this picture of our whole community somehow being evicted by the sheriff. It was never, we don't even own the community, we just lease it, so nobody could take it from us, but it was always the community where I saw it. And somehow there would just be this sweep of the civil authorities. The civil authorities would come and they'd just move us out, and there would be this scrambling moment while we'd all pack. And in my mental picture, we always packed in 1930s leather valises, like this. It's probably because I remember being a Jew back in Europe. That is probably how I was thrown out of my home there. But anyway, and then we're all standing just as we are, but we're holding these leather valises. Nobody has rolling suitcases, but we're just standing there. We're standing right on the road on Monroe, just a crowd of us. And everybody's telling jokes, and we're just laughing, and we're just sort of like north, south, east, or west. Which way are we going to go? And then we randomly choose a direction, and then the whole little crowd just starts off down the road. But I'm sure there's such a thing, which by the grace of God few of us experienced, of being freezing and hungry with no place to go. That's not a joke when that happens. But seek ye first the kingdom of God. And whatever comes of itself, let it come. If God gives more, we don't have to be so rude as to say, no thank you, I won't. That's what Swamiji was breaking me of when he pushed me out of the trailer and into the nice house and eventually to here. When we first arrived here, after living all those years, 16, in the country ashram, it was just astonishing. That's the only thing I can think of, because there's a vibration of materialism in this place that's just in the water and in the air molecules. And we've all lived in it so long, we think it's natural. We don't have the foggiest idea how unnecessary it is. But it is necessary if we're here. This is part of what we're doing. If God gives more, you have to enjoy it. When Swamiji would come here, we'd go to the Stanford Shopping Center on a regular basis. And we would ferret around and buy little things, and we enjoyed. He never taught us to hold back from it externally. There was a very profound lesson in that. Swamiji lived in this world very, very comfortably. We went to nice restaurants, we stayed in nice hotels, we traveled a lot, over the years. Present tense, except not for him. Now he's traveling through the infinite without the benefit of frequent flyer miles. He's free. But he took us through this world comfortably. He was showing us that in this age, we're not allowed to just go live in the cave and have one cloth that we wear and the one that we wash. That's not what God is asking of us. But don't think for a minute we're getting a free ride. That, this time we get to enjoy. This time we get to identify with all these material things. This time we get to, and I love this phrase, have it all. Depends on what it is. You may live in a certain way, but where is your heart? Where is yourself? Where is your sense of joy? How have you defined it? And if God has given you and you've enjoyed it, what happens when God takes it away? It's a wonderful exercise just to imagine all these different things that we use and just what happens. I mean, there's fires, there's floods, there's wars, there's cataclysms, all sorts of things happen. Things get completely obliterated. When in 1976, which was now a long time ago, a big forest fire went through Ananda village, and Jyotish and Devi's house burned down. In the Finding Happiness movie, they talk about that. There wasn't time in the film to talk about everything, but several of Jyotish's responses were very famous in that, including him telling his wife that their house had burned down by saying, that terrible problem we were having with leaks in the roof? Well, we don't have that problem anymore because the whole place is ashes, so there's just nothing to leak anymore. But the other part that happened was the fire, the houses were in a very densely wooded area, and the fire came up a meadow, but then it caught in the forested area, and then the fire started doing something they call tree topping, where the fire shoots up and then it goes from the tops of the trees. And it's very dangerous, very, very dangerous when that happened. And when we saw that happening, we had to abandon any hope of stopping the fire, and the focus turned to try to save what we could from the buildings that we saw were all going to go down, which was about 22 houses, I think is what we had. So people streaked out in various cars and trucks and either went to their own homes if they were threatened, or to someone else's house if you didn't live in that area. Well, Jyotish, apparently, this is how the story was told. He may correct it, but this is the apocryphal story. Apparently, as he was rushing toward his house, somebody shouted to him, "Save everything that's of value to you," which is an extremely unfortunate thing to say to such a philosophical person. Their baby was 10 days old. Devi and their son were away, but all the baby things were there. So the story is told that Jyotish walked into the middle of his house and said, "What is of value?" And they had all the things on their altar. They had been cleaning the altar, I guess, and it was all in a pile. So he picked up that and he just walked out of the house. Somebody else came afterwards and just took baby things and clothes and stuff like that. But if you think about it, it was a magnificent moment. Because it was sort of like there was this war going on between God and Maya at that moment. And Maya was taking the form of this huge, and believe me, it was big. It was a big fire. It was raging across this community that we'd spent not quite 10 years just working as hard as we could to build. The fire was just eating it up as if it was matches. Just nothing. Fire just, nothing stands against Mother Nature when she makes up her mind, believe me. So why cower in front of that? I've often meditated on his response. Just why cower in front of that? Why grab at a few things? Yes, there's common sense, which fortunately someone else came in and had. But nonetheless, just, okay. You gave it to me, God, and if you want to take it away, fine. What's of value to me? Symbolically, the pictures on the altar. Just walked out. Isn't that magnificent? Isn't there something that we can learn no matter what happens to us from that? Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And everything else that you ever think you ever need, you will also have it. Isn't that an extraordinary promise? Been proven true over and over, tested in your own life. And you'll find, like every other spiritual scientist before you, there is power, there is truth, there is joy. God bless you.